Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Kemmler. Our next guests are the documentary filmmakers behind the shows The Thing, the legendary promoters of rock, which charts the classic stories of those that brought us our favorite artists and created a business while doing it. Let's take a look.
I mean, I'm glad that this show has been done because they've done the producers, they've done this, they've done that, but they've never done, you know, a key part of rock and roll, the promoters who work their balls off to try and make this thing happen. I mean, I don't see how, you know, British rock and roll really happens without Harvey Goldsmith. I don't see it. You know, when you have Engelbert Humperdinck at the top of the bill, way down the bottom after 12 acts, Jimi Hendrix, you know. So, you know, he takes a punt because his friend Chas Chandler says there's this kid from the States. I don't see how it happens really without people like Bill Graham. The United States, being so vast, had individual guys in each city, in each area, that were exactly the same types. Their personality type was different. They were quiet or they were competent, but they were all a bit nuts. They were all gamblers. They were all risk takers, and they all were rock and rollers. As you get granular in the United States, as you pitch up in each town, and you met the real guys who owned that city and who could do it, that was very important. Because the big national promoter, forget that place, you know, you're not going to do anything, and nothing happened. But if you got close to Delsner and Maggot and Chicago and that, they would go and they would break you. And they are the successors to, you know, Colonel Tom's sort of carnival barking sort of thing. It goes directly into that. You can put gigs on in the Texas cinemas and stuff like that. But as this thing becomes the cultural center of society, it needed those figures on the margins who were prepared to take a punt, to put up money on this. And that's the same as a kid picking up a guitar and taking a punt on his life, saying, I'm going to do this until I can't, until it doesn't happen. Promoters, I can't see a difference. And they are absolutely essential.
Everybody put your hands together for the directors of the shows The Thing, Molly Bernstein and Philip Dolin. Let's hear it. Hey.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this documentary. As Bob Geldof says in that clip, it's really one of the stories, one of the few stories, one of the few rocks left sort of like unturned in the story of rock and roll. And I imagine that the two of you knew that going into this. Every story, it feels like every story about this era of rock has been told, but not this one. So how did it start for you guys?
Well, it's funny that Molly directed a film called Deceptive Practice about a magician named Ricky Jay. I was a producer on it, and in doing that, we became friendly with Winston Simone, Ricky's manager, who's been in the entertainment business for years, and he knew of these guys and revered them. And he and his wife would always say, this should be a film. So one night we were talking, they were saying, let's make another movie, it was so much fun. How about this one? And so they were the ones that kind of were our entree into this world of characters that everyone in the music business knows. Everyone knows Arnie Granite, everyone knows Ron Delsner. And it's a story that is just not known to most people, although people, when they come from a city, like I'm from Cleveland, I only heard the Belkin Brothers every weekend on the radio. They presented every concert. So somewhere in the minds of all the music fans, they've heard these names of these promoters.
So it starts with this one guy that you found, and basically he tells you who all the others are as well, and you start kind of jettisoning around the country to try to talk to the other ones?
Yeah, it's a group of 3 executive producers who are all agents and managers in the music business. And so they, you know, between the 3 of them introduced us to all the main characters. And we, of course, researched as well. We started learning about Bill Graham, who is a central figure in the story, who's died relatively young, sadly. But there's a lot of material about him, so we researched that. And Frank Barsalona, who's another big figure who started Premier Talent, which was the first agency to represent solely rock and roll acts. And he had all the great British invasion acts when they first came to the US. And so we did research and asked people about him. And we got to interview his wife and daughter, which was really fun because his wife was a journalist. She's
June
British.
Barsalona.
Yeah, and she's the she did the first interview with the Beatles in England. So she's really got some great stories, as you might imagine.
I mean, that's what's interesting. It really is the roots of rock and roll. So you have June Barsalona, first journalist to interview the Beatles. She met Frank. Frank booked the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and that's how the British invasion started cooking in the U.S. And somebody like a Ron Delsner, his first job as a concert promoter was the Beatles in Forest Hills, Queens. So it's really like they've been there since the beginning, and a lot of them are still around.
What I loved about Bill Graham's story was that he was dedicated to showing people the real roots of rock and roll as well. He didn't want any of the young people coming to these concerts to think that it began with the Dead or it began with who they were coming to see. And so he would book these incredible soul acts, right? Prior to that, were you surprised to hear that?
It was great to discover how sophisticated he was in terms of his understanding of the history of music and putting together different genres. And I guess I just didn't realize that that was a big part of his role in this history. And like discovering Carlos Santana, he was a big Latin music fan also. So it's really fascinating, I think, that he had such interesting taste and insight into how to help create these crossovers, as they call them.
But many people said to us, Bill Graham he said, if you want dessert, you've got to have your vegetables first, and the vegetables would be the Howling Wolf or the Miles Davis or whoever it might be that he was presenting, along with the sellout act.
Call those vegetables. I would call those the entree, really.
Absolutely.
Right.
What's so interesting, I think it was Bill Graham, the clip in the movie, forgive me for not remembering exactly which promoter it was, who says that the greatest gift for him in doing this is turning people on to new music, is putting a band that no one's heard before, or is the Roots or something maybe that audience doesn't know, before the headliner, and really turning them on to that and showing them new music. And it's so cool to see someone who cared so much more about that than the business side of it. I think most of the people that you're talking to do care more about that, but of course it also is a business for some. For Graham, it seemed like it was really just about turning people onto music.
I think for most of them that was the case. I mean, they were very passionate about music. Of course, they saw the opportunity, and it did become a huge business, and they all made a lot of money. So, but I really think that was they loved the music. They loved selling out shows. They
love finding opening acts that people would like, that the headliner, that the audience would like, who came for the headliner. That's what really turns them on, is this kind of presenting shows. And again, selling out is like that's the favorite thing in the world, to sell out a show.
But one thing many people, like Danny Scher, who worked for Bill Graham, said, and this didn't make it into the film, there's so many stories that we couldn't include, but he said Bill was very concerned with keeping ticket prices low, because he felt that was very important, so people could keep seeing people in these more intimate settings, in these small venues, and that's how you also can introduce people. And so
no one gives a damn about that anymore.
Yeah, the idea was like, the ticket price should be so low that you're just going to go, no matter who's there. It's Friday night, you go to the Fillmore.
The last person who notoriously cared about that, I believe, was Ian MacKaye of Fugazi, who would refuse to charge more than $5 for his shows, or $5 or $10, going into the 2000s when he would play live shows. One of the things that I was so struck by this film is that, yes, you have the companies putting the records out. Yes, of course, you have the musicians actually making the music. But in a certain way, these promoters, in the way that they had to get people to these shows and the way that they had to present the bands at this time, created what we know of as the rock star, and the promotional way to make a rock star, which in a lot of ways builds the myth of not just rock, but pop music, and how we present these sort of idols and these ideas for what could be an icon for us. Was that something that fascinated you as well, or something that you learned while making the film?
I'd say learned while making it, but and also they defined the rock concert as we know it. I mean, so it's both the stars and the concert, but
some are still doing it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them actually.
I mean, even the concept of going on the road. There was no road before the promoters who connected the cities so you could do a 40-city tour, be on the road. There was no such thing. So So they, and this is something that Steve Van Zandt, who appears in the film, said later. He gave artists a chance to breathe. He gave them some stability because they could do these tours and make money and develop their art.
Why was he in character at that presentation?
Well, I think he was in his Sopranos.
That's what
character.
I mean. Because I've seen him, I've interviewed him outside of that, and I was like, I've never seen him publicly come out as the character from The Sopranos.
I think he was making a not so subtle point that Frank Barcelona's network kind of had a
the early days
Casa Nostra feel to it.
Well, the early days of rock music are notorious, or at least the record industry are notorious for being mob run. And I've heard a lot of people who worked in the industry then and worked in it afterwards said that they preferred the mob run era because they got paid better. And now, like,
I'm not surprised.
now they have to sue to get what they're owed at this point, and the record company always has more money for lawyers than they do.
But one promoter said to us, if you saw the show Vinyl, that's exactly what it was like, but without the violence. So we didn't encounter any real mob parts to our story.
What were you most shocked to learn in this whole project?
I guess just how these people that are in, as I was growing up, I knew of as such huge icons like Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones, and just seeing the history of how before they were famous was just so interesting that, Led Zeppelin was playing at the Boston Tea Party with like 200 people. And just like on a stage with a spotlight. It's just, it really was the beginnings of what we know of as classic rock, I guess. And it was just so fun to hear about, David Bowie being discovered in Cleveland. I mean, that was one thing, is how important the regions were as opposed to national audiences in terms of building and breaking acts. And David Bowie and T-Rex and a lot of the glam acts really first became popular in Cleveland. It was a big rock town, and they had a great FM station, WMMS. And I guess that was another really interesting part. Not shocking, but interesting how significant FM radio was, and that was so new. To me, it's like I always thought concerts have always been around, FM radio's always been around. Then you realize, no, it was all new at that time. And the idea of playing a whole album on the radio was really novel, and unusual. And they were just experimenting, and the talent was exploding, So it's just very fun to be immersed in that.
I think I was most surprised. I really love the story of Larry Magid convincing Springsteen to do a stadium show. So that's another thing. It was this promoter who had the idea, starting with Pink Floyd. I'm putting you in a 10,000-seat arena. I think you can come back next time and play for 90,000. In his mind, he's thinking, I'll put up the money for the stadium. I'll do the ads. I'll print the tickets. I'll sell this show out. So it was his responsibility to do that. That's another thing that we didn't really know, is that the promoters would put up money and lose money sometimes. And so there's a great story in the film of Springsteen says, I'm never going to do a stadium. And he comes and he watches a 90,000 person Pink Floyd show and then says, I think I'm going to do this.
That's really kind of the beginning of that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
it was a promoter's idea that we could take a risk and do it.
Was Zeppelin doing stadium shows prior to that, or no? I mean, they were doing big arenas, but I don't think they were doing stadiums necessarily.
No.
Yeah.
I think it was so popular and growing so fast that the promoters just had to keep pace with the demand.
Yeah. You're absolutely right too about the timeline. These are things that happened not that long ago, but we take for granted as if they existed forever, even though some of it doesn't exist at all anymore in terms of like rock radio that presents new rock artists. That doesn't really exist anymore. It's mostly classic rock and pop. And I wonder, we're still modeling all of these musicians and all of these stars off of the iconography that was created at this time. Do you think there's an avenue now that would create new artists the same way that it was done then?
I don't know. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, there's so many differences in the culture now, and the technology and the distribution. And
I tend to think, as Geldof said at the end, that the rock and roll era is over. The real time when it really was reflective of the culture. I think there's always going to be great music. I think that kind of invention is probably happening somewhere else, like maybe YouTube channels or someplace, or shows like this or something. But I think there's always going to be artists creating new things, but I don't know if it's going to be musically anymore until things change or whatever. I don't know. This is a long conversation. Rap, I think, was kind of that. Creating something totally new.
Yet it still feels like we're going to be referencing at least the images that they created and the ways that they defined their era, no matter how much the industry changes as we move forward and how much the acts themselves change. Yeah. Let's get some questions from our audience. Who's a question?
Hi. So you actually just touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering, like, reviewing how, like, the creation of a rock star and how performance developed. What do you think is going to happen? Like, what important things are happening now that's going to create the new rock stars?
That's so funny because we have spent the last several years completely steeped in the 70s, so we don't even know what's going on now. So I don't. Yeah.
We got a turntable in the editing room and speakers, and we really got into it.
It's a totally different world. I mean, this is the thing I realize is, like, as this period passes into history, we can all listen to Jimi Hendrix, but very few people actually got to pay $4 and be 10 feet away from Hendrix. So I think, but it's funny, when we met John Bon Jovi, he was saying that his dream growing up was to play stadiums. That would have been completely no one would have ever thought of that before. I mean, Sinatra couldn't fill a stadium. It had never been done. 90,000 people to see one act. So who knows? I just think, I do have faith that music is amazing and will continue to inspire people, and there's always going to be great musicians. Yeah.
And it is interesting. Remember, Ron Delsner was telling us that those, David Bowie, Mick Jagger, a lot of those very early rock stars, really, they didn't start out to be rock stars. They were art students. They were doing very experimental stuff. They loved the Rolling Stones, loved the blues, but it wasn't until later that somebody would start out with, like you're saying, I guess, with that goal. I'm going to be a rock star. And
because the myths had been made.
Right, because they hadn't happened yet. So they,
Almost the same thing with pop stars and Madonna. To a degree, like the myth of what the pop star is and how to sell sexuality and how to do that was kind of made with Madonna.
Yeah. Right. And then you have K-pop, which is just...
I don't know where that comes, like what it... Next question.
Pop. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is, so obviously your film deals with a lot of really big stars of the 70s, like Jimi Hendrix and all of them. And so my question is, can you talk a bit about the responsibility you feel to the fans of those artists in this project, and to talk about their careers in a way that appeals to all of their fan bases but still tells the story?
Interesting. Well, I think, we tried to really evoke the feeling of being at the Fillmore and seeing Jimi Hendrix or, some of these Jethro Tull and people like that. Deep Purple, bands that really were huge for a couple of years.
Yeah, there's a lot of newspaper ads in the film.
So we tried
tickets,
to really...
Like, they don't even really have tickets anymore. The tickets were big, and the textures of the times.
Right. I think we thought if we could sort of evoke that texture, it'll appeal to people who couldn't be there but love those artists. I mean, it did for us anyway. Like, discovering some of the archival material was amazing, and we worked with this wonderful photographer, Emily Rothschild. This is her photo. And we have about 100 images she took at the Fillmore East and Woodstock. She was an NYU film student, and she became the in-house photographer for the Fillmore East and photographed every act that was there.
And she's often on stage, like a foot away from them, because no one thought that was strange to be a foot away from Jimi Hendrix at the time.
So she shot photos and film, 16mm film. And she had total access. I mean, like Philip said, but she'd go backstage. She was at all the rehearsals. She'd be at the parties.
Did she have an archive of all that 16mm footage? And was that like, did you have to get rights for it or anything because of the artists?
Yes.
Of course.
So that was still copywritten because the artists are on it.
Well, yes, and it's a complicated thing. But the
I was
photos
about that with the music and everything.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal getting all the music cleared and
that's part of the challenge of making a documentary.
Right.
Is you have to look at who owns the stuff that you want to show and get permissions, often from multiple people for each piece of it. But I was going to say that I think these promoters love the audience. I mean, there's a scene in the film of Ron Delsner picking up trash before a show. We know that Bill Graham used to wheel out a cart with hot chocolate on cold nights when people were waiting in line and try to keep ticket prices low. So they love the fans, and they wanted, I think that's what, if they could present an opening act and they loved it and they came back and they could sell out that act the next time, that's what they really live for. So they really wanted the fans to have a good show and really have fun.
I think I have time for one more.
Hi. So I'm studying filmmaking at NYU actually, and I'm always kind of curious about the behind the scenes of making the film. So I was just wondering if there was anything that surprised you when you made it that kind of had to change the direction of where you were originally going, or just any challenges that came up.
I think probably the main thing is once we started editing, I think initially we thought this is really going to be the story of these different promoters and each of their stories and their biographies, which were fascinating. I mean, you know, it was one, we had probably our first cut had sort of each of their stories. How did they get into the business? What was their background, et cetera.
How long was your first cut?
Oh, God, no.
It was the same length.
Really?
Well, no, it was a bit
A bit long. Okay, I guess it was long. Yeah, it was probably 2 hours.
2 hours or something. But then we realized, no, it's really, there's a bigger story. It's not just their stories. It's the story of how this whole industry got created. So then we kind of went back, and that's when we went to London and decided to include Bob Geldof and Harvey Goldsmith, who's a huge British promoter who produced Live Aid. And, you know, so we sort of opened it up and realized, let's try to tell a bigger story. So.
And the beauty of documentary is there is no script, so you always have to be fluid. And if you're interviewing somebody and they bring up something interesting, you follow that point and you ask the next person that. You kind of develop your themes that way. So you're always kind of shifting gears and looking around and thinking about what should be included or not included.
But it was a really fun process, not knowing very much about it going into it. So we really learned about it by interviewing the people who were there, which was just so fun and interesting and inspiring, you know.
Well, congratulations on the film. People can see the show's The Thing. It's at Doc NYC right now.
Actually, it premiered last night. Okay. The festival is over.
Oh, nope.
So,
but we're going to have new things. We have a website, theshowsthething.com.
Right.
Which will have other screenings and festivals and things like that.
Fantastic. Everybody give Molly and Philip a big round of applause. Let's hear it.
Thank you.